So I will give the floor just right now to the Dr. Erik Solheim. Good afternoon from Geneva there, Doctor.
Good afternoon, Geneva. I would say good evening to all the Asian participants. It's quite late already in parts of Asia, but so happy to join this meeting. And let me start by celebrating something very positive which happened last weekend, where China played a key role. And that was bringing together Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two arch enemies of the Middle East, one the proponent of Sunni Islam, the other the proponent of Shia Islam, two nations which had been into a number of shady wars in the Middle East over the last decades. It's not like all these will disappear just by the Chinese initiative, but it's likely to have very positive impact on Yemen, Syria, and a number of other conflicts in the Middle East, and for sure bringing together these two giants, economic and political giants in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia. We should celebrate the good news because, yes, as Professor Butt and Admiral Collenberg hinted to, there are also bad news, but this is really good news. And it's a triumph for Chinese diplomacy. And coming from the West, I may identify a couple of reasons why China was able to do this. China has stayed out of every war since 1979. While we in the West has basically been involved in every war since 1979. And China has taken the view that when there is a conflict, it will try to keep a link to both parties to the conflict and find solutions, and not pushing weapons or simple political solutions. And added, China had been able to be close to both Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's not an easy task, but it's very, very important if we want to solve conflicts. I really pay tribute to this diplomatic initiative of China. But I think it speaks loudly about the world which we are entering into, because for all practical reasons, this is the Asian century. If we go back to 1750, the economy of China was about maybe 2%, it was about 30% of the world, and of India maybe 25%. Then at the independence in 1949, they were down to 2 or 3% each. So it was from being the giants of global economy to basically being reduced to nothing. And of course, the same was the case with what is today Pakistan and many other parts of Asia. But since then, there's been just progress. At an independence, China and India life expectancy was 30 years, even probably a little bit below 30 years. Now life expectancy in India is 68, in China is 78, and life expectancy in China this year passed life expectancy in the United States of America. What an achievement in 75 years' time, enormous achievements. At independence, very few Chinese and hardly any Indians could read and write. Now, of course, every single child in China is in school, and nearly all children in India also starting in school, even if in some places, of course, education is not of the quality which we wish to have. So there is fantastic progress, and when we can celebrate progress in the world, it's largely due to Asia, because Asia was seen as the continent of poverty in the 50s and 60s, even into the 70s. There were UN conferences saying that Asia can never feed itself. This is the continent of poverty. This is the place which can never, ever succeed. And then Asians proved exactly the opposite. And now it's thanks to economic growth in Asia that the world economy overall is improving. And thanks to Asia that overall, while we're not fully successful, overall there is progress on basically all sustainable development goals. And look to my core area, Asia is now leading the charge for sustainability for the environment on every technology we can think of, which is green. China is the world leader. 82% of all solar panels in the world last year were made in China. 70% of all electric batteries were made in China, and most of the rest in South Korea, by the way. 57% of all electric cars in the world were sold in one country alone, that is China. So whatever you think of green hydrogen, solar, wind, high-speed rail, China is the world leader of green technologies. But India is soon moving into a second position. In a couple of years, India for sure will be the second biggest solar power in the world, next to China. And Prime Minister Modi is launching any number of green initiatives, basically by the day. It's called green missions, that is using the state to promote green development, very much in the same way as South Korea did in the past with enormous success. So there's a lot of progress to celebrate, and Belt and Road is one part of that. Admiral Columbus and Professor Butt has set out a number of the progress which has happened in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan, thanks to Belt and Road. I mean, I was just in Colombo, and the roads are frankly much better than they were a few years ago. And it's to a large extent thanks to China, because Sri Lankans have made this road, but China's provided technology and knowledge and for sure money for this to happen. And it takes maybe half an hour from the airport to Colombo now, and it will take maybe 1.5 hours in the past with heavy traffic in narrow roads. So this is great progress. But go around, Laos, landlocked country in Asia, now linked to the entire global system for transport of goods through the Yunnan Laos Railroad, which link it to the Eurasian rail link. Hanoi Metro, Bandung to Jakarta Railroad, Trans-Malaysia Railroad, Trans-Thailand Railroad, of course, massive railroads in Kenya, in Ethiopia. There are so many testimonies to the importance of Belt and Road to improve the lives of people. And of course, it's not just infrastructure, not just transport, it's education, it's health, it's people-to-people contacts. There are so many dimensions which Belt and Road has helped developing nations. And that's why nearly all developing nations in the entire world, whether you speak of Latin America or Africa or Asia, they're all part of Belt and Road. The one big exception is India for geopolitical reasons, which we can all understand, but basically every other developing nation is part of Belt and Road, and they are completely voluntary parts of Belt and Road. They do it because they believe it benefits their nation. Some people are speculating why China has launched this 10-year-old initiative, which was launched in Kazakhstan 10 years ago by President Xi Jinping. I see 3 reasons for that, and I believe these 3 reasons are exactly the same as when the United States were providing the so-called Marshall help to Europe after the Second World War. And they're all 3 acceptable and understandable. One is a simple wish to help. You want to help nations which have not been so successful as China. I mean, China has grown at a speed, at a scale as no other nation in human history, and they want to help nations which have not achieved that by providing investment, sharing experience, and many other ways. Second is, of course, an enlightened view on the economy. If Chinese business shall thrive, shall provide jobs in China, we shall bring all in China up into the middle class, well, it needs to be internationalized. It needs to work with other parts of the world to share experience, to export products, to import raw materials, whatever it may be. And no economy can really succeed by its own. So it's an enlightened view of the economy. And thirdly, yes, China wants to be seen in a good light. But is that just China? When the United States or Germany or Japan, whatever nation is providing development aid, because they want to be seen in a good light. That's one reason why they do it. Nothing wrong with that. Every nation wants to influence others, at least to show respect to themselves for this. So this as a wish to help, enlightened view of the economy, and yes, power assumption that you will, if you help others, you will get in a good light, and it will help you in any other area. These are the 3 reasons why China is doing it, and we should respect them all. And they're exactly similar to what have been the reason for the United States when they have been on their best. Then there are criticisms to Belt and Road, and let me mention 3 of them. Admiral Columbus spoke about the so-called debt trap. I mean, that is pure and simple anti-Chinese propaganda, nothing less. Sri Lanka, which I know very well, Admiral Columbus said it, 9% of the debt is to China, the rest is to India, to the International Monetary Fund, to Japan, to Western donors, to many others. Why then single out China as the main problem? What Sri Lanka needs is exactly what President Wickremesinghe is now doing, an agreement with China, and President Xi has said that he will play ball with Prime Minister Modi of India with the International Monetary Fund, with everyone to work in concert to help Sri Lanka. And I'm very sure that President Wickremesinghe will achieve that in the very near future. And on that basis, gradually bringing Sri Lanka up from the current difficult economic circumstances. But there's no difference. I mean, yes, China has helped developing the port of Colombo or the building roads. Other nations have also invested, and there need to be a solution to the debt. But why use this as a propaganda tool against China? And the same is the case everywhere else. To the country, it's probably much more easy to get a debt relief from China than from some of the multilateral institutions, which are very bureaucratic and tend to be difficult to negotiate with. Second criticism is that Belt and Road is about Chinese power. And as I said, yes, it's about Chinese power, because if you help others, you will get into a better relationship with them, which will help you overall. But that's no reason to speculate about that. It's completely normal. The third criticism, which was true in the past, but is no longer true, is that Belt and Road was far too brown, meaning not environment friendly. The number of investments which can be criticized from an environment point of view was a lot of coal, a lot of oil and gas. But after President Xi 1.5 years ago said that China will stop all overseas coal investment, and that happened at exactly the same time as nations like Kenya and Bangladesh and many others also wanted to get out of coal, we see a drastic slowdown in coal and a full stop in coal. And of course, we will then see massive investment in solar and wind and green hydrogen and all the great green technologies that China is the world leader, and also have the financial resources to invest. So what was a somewhat brown initiative is now one of the greenest initiatives in the world. This has created some concerns in the West. My view is very simple. If there is some criticisms to China in the West should simply do better. I'm not aware of any developing nation which want to be only with the United States or only with China. Everyone wants to be friendly both with the United States and China. The case point here, I mean, Pakistan or Sri Lanka is very clear. I mean, none of these nations just want to be only with China. They want also to be with China, but of course also a good relationship to the West, to Japan, to Korea, to many other potential investors. So there's no reason to be skeptical. And so far, the Western kind of counter initiatives have been a lot of talk and not so much action. You may recall at the G7 meeting in the United Kingdom 2 years ago, it was launched a Western counter initiative to Belt and Road. So far as I have registered, no secretariat, no money, no budget, no program, no nothing. Just frankly, a media opportunity and nothing more. And people look through this, and we cannot fool the world. People look through this. So what Western nations should do is to raise similar amounts of capital for developing the world, for investment. And we should look into much more how we can be complementary to each other rather than competitive. In some areas, China has experience which the West don't have. And China is producing 82% of the solar panels in the world. It's probably very realistic that China is the best help when it comes to invest in solar. When China has produced 70% of all high-speed rail in the world in the last decades, while the United States has produced absolutely zero, not 1 kilometer high-speed rail, it's much more likely that China has the experience, the knowledge, the technology, the people to make investments in high-speed rail than the United States, which has none of this domestically. So let China focus when they are at the best. There are some areas where the United States can compete. Still, the American universities are seen as the best in the world. Inviting students from Africa or developing countries to the great American universities is a great service to the world, because they get knowledge which are very much asked for in basically all developing countries. Health is an area where the United States, we say Bill Gates and others have done a lot of service to the world. But you should look into how the West and China could be complementary rather than this zero-sum game of competition. Yes, there is business competition, that's sound, but let's look into how we can work together. Finally, whatever is the issue over time, we need to work together. Whether it's development, poverty, peace, terrorism, we need to work together. Look to how much more difficult it would have been to defeat the ISIS terrorist group if the different powers have worked counter purpose to each other. Maybe some had even supported the terrorists. That was the case during the Cold War, where the Americans basically supported any anti-Soviet group anywhere in the world, and the Soviet Union supported any anti-American group in the world, and it made it much, much more difficult. So we need to work together. The biggest obstacle to working together today is the Western idea that when you modernize, you also need to Westernize. Look, I mean, from the very first non-Western nations which developed, and that was Japan, that was the core issue for them. How could they modernize Japan while still being Japan and true to the historical culture and not Westernize? And same with Korea later, but Japan is very much Japanese today. Korea is very much Korean. China is very much Chinese. I mean, the Chinese governing system, in my view, is basically a reflection of 2,500 years of history. Sometimes it's called communist. It's much more Confucian. It's a system which was developed at the very latest in 2200 before Christ, when the Han Dynasty came into power. First the Qin and then the Han Dynasty come into power in China. And it's reflecting of the collective memory of the Chinese people throughout this history. The beauty of that is there's not one Chinese, I've never ever met a Chinese who thought that system could be exported somewhere else, that Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Norway or the United States could adopt their governing system. They understand this is a Chinese system that serves China well, but it's not for export. We need to take a lot more of the same approach in the West. Frankly, the American political system has served America well. It's one of the most developed nations in the world, and while there have been some problems in the last decade for sure, overall, the United States have been able to bring great presidents at the most difficult times of their history, like Lincoln or Roosevelt or Washington. So the democratic system has served the United States very well. There is no reason why we cannot coexist. We should give up the idea that others should adopt a Western system. And of course, the Chinese, as I said, will never expect their system to be exported. Prime Minister Modi, in my view, is doing exactly that in India now. He is basing his rule on the historical culture roots of India linked to Hinduism, and in that sense, making India more Indian and more true to the real roots of Indian history. But this is happening everywhere. President Erdogan is Turkey is doing a lot of the same. We see nations understand that we can modernize, we can bring enormous prosperity, while at the same time being true to our roots and not adopt other systems. And the West need to get out of its missionary instinct that the entire world should accept every idea, I mean, when I read, and I read a lot of articles from the foreign policy establishment in Washington, and nearly every time there is the idea that America should intervene in some form whenever there is a problem in the world. Well, that time has gone. The world will not accept it. And it's not right either, because the competence is not just in Washington, it's competence in every capital and every corner of the world. And we need to find a way to work together. And there's no reason whatsoever that we cannot coexist, cooperate on all joint issues, getting out of COVID, improving the world economy, solving climate change, defeating terrorism, finding solutions to the war in Ukraine. All this we need joint efforts. Then we need to work together, even if systems are different. It's a great saying in the old Vedas of India. It says, the entire universe is one family. That is the approach we need to take in the 21st century also. We are in it together. Together we can resolve problems. Separated and in conflict, it will be much, much more difficult. So the whole universe is one family. Thank you so much. Xie xie in Chinese.
Thank you very much there, Doctor. You give some numbers and you was very objective, you know, with all the issues that you mentioned about the BRI and SDGs, and I think this is important to mention that in events like this one. So we search evidently with event like this one to be really objective, and really thank you, because you was really professional, and it's important to know that from you. We have one question that was right for the Professor Solheim. So you mentioned that BRI contribute to enhancement of human rights and overstretching of national security. Too much resources is devoted to security, but also there will be a World Democracy Summit, or too much results also pour it into democracy. Professor, maybe could you answer that?
Yeah, look, in the middle part of the 20th century, East Asia was the scene of most wars. I mean, more than 80% of all who died in conflicts in the world died in East Asia, in Korea and in Vietnam and many other places. In the early 1980s, the great Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, but also many other East Asian leaders, whether in Korea or in Singapore and many others, that decided we will prioritize economy. We will not prioritize military, we prioritize economy. And they prioritized the economy over military, and that's why also China stayed out of every war since the war with Vietnam in 1979. This has for sure served China extremely well. China has a much lower percentage of its state budget in the military than the United States, much lower part of its GDP in the military than the United States, simply because it prioritized economic development above everything else. And the result has been that now East Asia is the most peaceful part of the world. There's not one military conflict of any significance in East Asia. There are conflicts in Africa, there are some in Latin America, in other parts of Asia, but not in East Asia. And that is because of this attitude: we will give priority to peace and we'll give priority to economic uplifting of our people, which also has succeeded fantastically. There is no mirror image between China and the United States. I mean, the United States ask or demand the right to be able to send their military forces exactly to the border to China. They demand to send their Air Force carrier to the Chinese sea border. There's no Chinese carriers in the Caribbean or up to the closer coast of California or at the Bahamas or Barbados. I mean, you will never see a Chinese carrier there. If one had to come, there would be a revolution in Washington. There would be a panic if the Chinese were to send military forces that close to China. That close to the United States, as the United States demand to do versus China. So we should learn from this priority of peace. I mean, China can do better in some areas. They can find ways of resolving or reducing the dispute with India in the Himalayas. They have some unresolved dispute with some Southeast Asian nations on some of the islands there. And China, in my view, should take a low profile in these issues, because that will give more leverage to China. But overall, China has been an enormous force for good and for peace. In the Security Council of the UN, the one nation which is using the veto power the least, again, is China. It's not the Western powers, not for sure not Russia, but it's China. So let us give credit to this policy of peace, and let's take more of it. When it comes to human rights, yes, there are some areas where West has a lead compared to China on human rights. I mean, the ability to speak exactly your view on every issue is more developed in the West. But if you take the human rights as a whole, please read the Human Rights Declaration of the UN. It's a fantastic document. It starts with the right to live, the right to existence, the right to food, the right to education, the right to health, the right to pray to whatever God you want to pray to. All this is part of the Human Rights Declaration. And for nearly all these rights, there have been enormous progress in China. and China has a lot to discuss with the world and to teach the world. And we cannot have this very, very narrow view of human rights. That is just a few areas where, yes, the West may be ahead of China.
Okay, thank you there, Doctor. So the same question was made for the Admiral Colombage, and he answered that so what I mean is BRI contributes to promote human rights with development prospect and bringing people out of poverty and providing them with better opportunities. Overstretching national security is by those who are against BRI, as they put every aspect into national security to block the progress of BRI and China. Yes, democracy summit will divide people more. We don't need a summit of this nature when the world is engulfed with many burning issues. Resources should be provided to alleviate suffering of people rather than having a major summit to divide people. This is the answer of the Professor Colombage. And maybe Professor Solheim, I have maybe a second question for you that was made too by the people that watch us just right now. I thought, as you say, China is not involved in any of those armed conflicts. Still, it has always been criticized. For instance, in terms of human rights, they will be surely once again to be targeted for this Mount World Democracy Summit. How do you comment that?
I am not sure that these democracy summits are very helpful because they create a very artificial dividing line between so-called democracies and more authoritarian structures. Singapore is one of the most successful nations in the world. Basically, every individual on the entire planet would love to live in Singapore if they could. Well, Singapore is not invited to this conference because it's not seen as a perfect democracy. Africa, there is not one democracy in Africa where the dividing line is ideology or left or right politics, anything like that. In basically every nation in Africa, even if it's a democracy, the dividing line is ethnicity. It's tribe, it's religion, it's geography, but it's ethnicity. In some nations, I lived in Kenya, 99.99% of the people voted for one leader, and if you were Kikuyu, 99% voted for one. If you were Luo, the other main tribe in Kenya, 99% voted for the other. So it's a fully tribal or ethnic or religious context, not an ideological. So it's not obvious that the democratic system as it developed in the United States is very suitable for these circumstances. And take the war in Ukraine. The United States has tried to put that as a war between autocracy and democracy. This struggles in two main dimensions. One is that, of course, Ukraine before the war was no democracy. Ukraine was one of the most failed states in the world. Out of the 16 post-Soviet nations, Ukraine was probably the least successful. Kazakhstan, which had a more authoritarian system, well, in 1989, Ukraine and Kazakhstan was at the same level. 30 years later, Kazakhstan was 3 times richer per capita than Ukraine. And everyone who visited Kazakhstan versus Ukraine could see how much better the living conditions were in Kazakhstan versus Ukraine. So Ukraine was not a democracy, which is important to defend before the war. And secondly, if you make it an issue of autocracy versus democracy, you divide the world. When President Biden went to Saudi Arabia and tried to mobilize Saudi Arabia to stand up for democracy in Ukraine, because it was a complete non-starter. Saudi Arabia will not do that. But even big developing nations' democracy, like in India, Indonesia, or Brazil, which are the 3 out of the 4 biggest democracies in the world with the United States, none of these nations want to defend democracy in Ukraine. What they want to defend is sovereignty in Ukraine. All these nations believe it's a very bad idea that Russia can grab a part of another nation and include it into its own landmass. because if you accept that the national sovereignty shall not be defended, there is no limit. There's no nation in Africa where not another nation can make a claim to your sovereignty, and even in large part of Asia, there's any number of overlapping claims for sovereignty. So if you don't accept national sovereignty as a non-starter, you do not attack the national sovereignty of another nation, we will have any number of wars. So as far as I can see, every nation in the world, China, India, Pakistan, whatever nation, are ready to support the national defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine. And that should be the core issue of the war. If you make it democracy versus autocracy, you simply divide the world. There's much less support for Ukraine than it could have been. And you make it a dividing line rather than bringing everyone together. Look to how George Bush Sr. during the first Iraq war over Kuwait in 1990, he brought the entire world together behind the Americans in the defense of the sovereignty of the state of Kuwait. That's the same approach we should take now to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine, rather than to be divided in between more or less democratic nations.
Great. Really very much for your answer. For us as